Okay. These are not inequalities. These are equations. And this is leading up to what the last thing that we'll do in this unit is, which is inequalities of this type. But what we have to do here with all of these is we have to um, undo what's happening outside of the absolute value. Here's the absolute value, and you can see this plus 10 is happening outside of it. So we need to undo that from both sides. We need to say minus 10, minus 10. Okay? Oops. And then don't forget, we're not writing just x down here. It still says absolute value of x. And if you fail to continue writing that, then you're not going to get this right. Okay? Now check it out. We say equals, and 1 minus 10 is negative 9. Okay. This is a super interesting situation because, and you truly need to think about this deeply, when you do an absolute value of any number, you always get a positive number, unless you took the absolute value of 0. Okay, absolute value of 0 is 0. But what you're saying is, as a positive number, how far is this number from 0? Okay, and we don't know what the number is, but watch, you can't take an absolute value of x and get a negative. It's impossible. What number could you possibly put in there that when you took its absolute value, it became negative? If you understand anything about absolute value, negative and positive numbers both have an absolute value that is positive. So how can you get a negative number as an absolute value? You can't. You can't. And so what do we write here? We write no solution. Oops. And why is it no solution? No solution because there is no number that has an absolute value of negative 9. This is because this is due to the fact that absolute values are never negative. Absolute values are never negative. So once you solve down, and this is the trick with these, you have to first undo anything that's happening outside so that what you've just got is the absolute value of something with nothing else happening outside the absolute value bars, okay, on that side. Can it equal a negative? No, never, okay? That's such an important point that I spent the time to emphasize it. But let's go do the rest. Okay. So we have a couple of things happening outside the absolute value bars. We've got to get it down to just those absolute value bars. So we have this times 6, and we have this minus 2. The minus 2 is the thing that we've got to undo first with the plus 2 on both sides. And we get 6, absolute value of n, is equal to 12. Okay? What's happening outside the absolute value bars? It's being multiplied by 6. So we need to undo that by saying 6 absolute value of n divided by 6 equals 12 divided by 6. Okay, the idea is that these cancel out. Don't drop the absolute value bars right now. Okay, it still says absolute value of n is equal to 2. Okay, now it is possible for an absolute value to equal 2 because it's a positive number. And so now, at this point, this is what we always do with these types of problems. Once you get it down to the absolute value part, You take what's inside. There's an n inside. You take what's inside and you set it equal to the number that's here, 2. And then you do it a second time. Take what's inside and set it equal to the opposite, right here, -2. Okay, and the reason is the absolute value of 2 is 2, and the absolute value of -2 is 2. Both of these numbers for n give you an absolute value of 2. Okay, how do you graph it? Well, what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, let's mark it. This is 0. This is, let's say, 1. This is 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Just decided to spread the numbers out by going every half unit. And we've got an endpoint at 2, filled in, of course, because it's exactly that number. And we've got a point at -2. But since it's not an inequality, we're not shading like some connecting line between them, because the numbers that are between -2 and 2 aren't solutions. Those aren't numbers that we can put in here and get 2 as the absolute value of that. That's the answer. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we need to undo what's happening to the absolute value bars. What's happening to it? Well, first we've got being divided by 5, and then we've got +1 added to it, okay, equals 0. So the first thing we're going to do is -1, -1. And we get absolute value of p when divided by 5 equals -1. Okay, now what do? We multiply both sides by 5, because that's what we're trying to do, is undo what's happening to this absolute value of p. Okay, we see it's divided by 5, so we do times 5. 5 parentheses, absolute value of p over 5 equals 5 parentheses -1. Okay, the idea of this is these canceled out, and what you get is absolute value of p is equal to -5. Remember what I'd said in this first slide. If you get it just down to the absolute value part and it's equal to a negative, it's impossible. It's impossible for some value of p, when you take its absolute value, you end up with a negative. Absolute values are never negative. So, no solution. And I just cut and pasted from that first slide. No solution. Why? Because there is no number that has an absolute value of -5. This is due to the fact that absolute values are never negative. Okay, and once you get it down to just the absolute value part, everything else that's going on outside of it has been undone. If you get a negative number, it's impossible, so there's no solution. Okay, so check it out. We are down to just the absolute value part, right? Nothing happening outside of these bars on the left-hand side of the equals. Just absolute value. And what do we do when we take the absolute value of this amount? We get a negative number. What do we know about it? Can absolute values equal a negative number? No, they can't. So we say there is no solution, because there is no number that has an absolute value of, sorry, I pasted this from the earlier one, absolute value of -5. There's no number that has an absolute value of -5, or no expression even, because this is a little expression, right? Nothing that has an absolute value of -5. This is due to the fact that absolute values are never negative. So x plus 1/2 can't have an absolute value that's negative, because there's never an absolute value equaling a negative number. Okay, that's it. So 3 out of these 4, once you solved it down to the absolute value, or when you saw that there was nothing but an absolute value of something, when it was negative, we had no solution. Of course, that's going to come up. And if you don't catch that, if you don't memorize and learn that idea that you're never going to take an absolute value and it results in a negative number, if you don't understand that, you'll get those problems wrong. So get your mind around this. Watch it again, ask questions, but don't leave this video not fully getting that and then just be okay with it. Like you shouldn't be okay with it until you figure out what's going on here.